All right, so for this next section, we are going to practice a little bit of a transfer and we're going to practice some shading just to refresh your memory, to give you a bit of a challenge. This is a pretty complex image, so I want to see kind of where you are with this. And yeah, so first step is to transfer the image into your grid. So I've already given you the grid. I've already made your boxes the same size. You don't have to measure anything. You're welcome. So let's take a second to look at what I transferred here before we even go any further. So I have the big obvious things like the placement of his nose, the shape of his eyes, the border of where his mustache is. Yes, but there's also things that I have like this looks very like blobby and bizarre because I've also taken the time to outline where I see highlights and shadows. So for example, this kind of like highlighted shape here on his cheek, that is existing in my drawing right here. This highlight on like where his cheek meets his nose is existing in my drawing right here. You know, the shape of the bags of his under eyes, all of these little creases and shadows on his nose, the highlights from the wrinkles at the top of his nose, these like subtle highlights, like there are subtle shadows curving around his nose and the highlight here, all of that exists in my drawing. And now that I'm looking at it, I forgot a couple of things. Oh goodness, I could draw this forever. So this is what your drawing should look like before you start to shade. It should have this amount of information. The more time you take to make sure that this is correctly placed, the easier it is to shade. So if you kind of create this little like paint by number for yourself and you place all of the values appropriately, then shading is incredibly easy. You're just matching the value, but you already know where to put it. So I would pause this. Obviously, you're going to take some time to draw this. It's going to take a little bit. It's small, but it's pretty complex. And then when you are ready to come back for shading, or if you want to just keep watching now for some shading tips, you know, open this video back up again. Okay, so I'm ready to shade my drawing. It's obviously already been transferred. I personally like to start with my darkest areas. Just a personal preference. I like to get the stuff that's really dark so I know that kind of where my base level is, if you will. Areas like not just shadows, but also little details. So that way I like to kind of work my way up the value scale. And it kind of helps me like figure out where stuff is because this is a huge jumble of lines currently. And I think it's really easy to sometimes get lost in what you're shading if you don't have any kind of like defining points in there. So I'm just kind of trying to make sense of what I drew here. And in the course of shading, if I find that like my placement on some things maybe was incorrect, I'm gonna be switching it. Like I drew this a little bit too far over, so I'm just gonna make that change as I go. So I'm still looking at my reference image. I'm still making sure what I'm drawing is correct. All right, so I'm not gonna bore you with all of the shading. So let's move on to something, I don't know, let's say his nose here. So I have my really dark shadow. This area is kind of dark. It's like a medium gray here. So I'm gonna lessen up on my pressure with my ebony so I can get some shapes of values in there. And I'm following my guide. I've already outlined where my stuff is going, and you can see that you can't really see my guides through my shading, like all this pencil and stuff, because I've drawn it so lightly that I don't really have to worry about erasing it because I can't see it anyways. All right, so this is getting really, really light. I'm barely even pressing down here. That a light gray wraps around his nose a little bit, and then it comes up the side. And you'll notice that I haven't even picked up my blending tool yet. It's not because I'm not going to use it, definitely am, but I just want to get my basic values in there before I start blending stuff out. I think if you start blending too early, it's really easy to get lost because then you blend out essentially all of your guidelines. So I'm just getting enough in here so that I have something to blend later. My very, very light values, I'm gonna let those happen with my blending tool. Even before I start, I'm gonna kind of clean this off down here because I don't want it to be like boom, like black across his face. Okay, so I'm gonna start in an area that's pretty dark, give myself a little bit of wiggle room here. So I'm already looking at this, and I already know that I made this area entirely too dark. Not panicking. I just know that I need to go back and make some changes and use my eraser to lighten that up. But I want to get everything blended in here, and I'm not pressing like hard at all. I'm like just barely even touching the paper because I don't want to make these values too dark. And there's already quite a bit of ebony on my blending tool. All right, so if I'm looking at this nose compared to this nose, some things going on here. I made this way too dark down here. So I'm just really lightly, like I'm just barely touching it. I'm kind of drawing with it almost. I'm gonna lighten this up. The nostril is like way higher. So my shape of my value kind of got distorted here as I was shading. This area right here is a lot lighter. So this is like a constant tweak that I'm doing here. Now that I have my value in here, I'm just going to be going back and tweaking things with my blending tool, with my eraser, maybe adding more with my ebony to keep changing this. Like, whoop, that is way too dark on the bridge of his nose until I get it right. So this has a long way to go. I'm not going to make you watch me shade the entire thing, but keep going, and then we'll talk about this bottom section when you're done shading this.